It's been a little while since I did one of these quick takes videos in which I give you some reflections and advice that might be helpful for you as somebody who's interested in philosophy, whether in an academic way or on your own as a lifelong learner or engaging in more popular discussions. And this one is motivated by a meme and by some discussions surrounding it that I thought could be useful as a launching point for talking about stuff. And I'm going to give you right up front the, what do they call it? The, shortened version of it. The idea here is that things that back in the past you found cool as you were just beginning to study philosophy, they could still be quite cool even if you thought that you should leave them behind, so don't be afraid of returning to them. Now, there's a lot of qualifications and provisos that we have to make about that, so we'll get into that in just a moment. But I do want to start by talking about the meme itself and my own take on it, my initial take, so that you got a little bit of background. So indulge me for a moment. So this is coming from I would say, one of the best philosophical meme pages out there in Facebook, which is Pedagogical Memes on Philosophical Themes. You may have also seen, and I'll put a link to it below, my interview with the page author, Daniel Heber, who's a instructor of philosophy and uses memes to help people learn about philosophy, not just in his own classes, but on the internet worldwide. So he put out this meme, and you can see an image of it here where he's saying, everything you thought was cool when you first got into philosophy is still cool. The forms, Stoicism, Gettier problems, early Wittgenstein, all of it. Now, my own initial take on this is a little bit more hedging, not committing to all of it necessarily. I wrote, this is a good one and rings more or less true. If you give uncritical credence to the views of others, sometimes you can get led into thinking something you thought was cool really isn't, not good for you when it really is. That said, there can be things we were mistaken about being cool that really weren't. And I'm saying that from my own experience, but also looking at other people as well. So what is the crux here? There's, a strong possibility that when you first started studying philosophy, whether it was like in an intro to philosophy class or your friends getting together or just reading on your own, there were some things that you found really captivating, really cool. You had a response to it, a subjective and we could say aesthetic response. And that's great. You don't need to be some brainiac who only responds logically to things. It's great to have affective responses. That's part of what is central to us as human beings. And, the key is not just to have that, but also to have some thinking going along with it. But, the world of thought is something that we should find exciting. So there are probably all sorts of ideas that when you were younger and fresher and newer, perhaps naive at the philosophy game or racket or business, you found really cool. And we'll talk about what cool means in just a bit. And then time goes on and, maybe years pass, perhaps semesters or whatever. And, you're told, oh, no, that's not cool. That's old hat. Nobody cares about that sort of stuff anymore. And you kind of give in to this, what would we call it, like temptation, seduction, this learning from your betters about what you should actually be spending your time on. How do you reliably use your time? And you push that stuff off and you're like, yeah, that's not cool anymore. And I've done some videos that you might find helpful about this, about not giving in to like, fads and prestige, making sure that when people make sweeping statements, they actually can back them up, which typically they can't. All sorts of things like that. I'll put links to those earlier quick takes that might be relevant to you about that. Now, there were a number of responses to this, and I think that some of the things that I have to say here, can take off from those responses. And I think that's a very useful thing that happens in social media. We get a good dialogue of sorts going. So a number of people wrote in with, sort of suggestions. Well, is Camus still cool? Some of us, that was the first book I actually read of philosophy, was Camus' Myth of Sisyphus when I was, a teenager in high school. I borrowed it from my uncle. Can't say I understood more than 10% of it. But, a lot of people do encounter absurdism or something like that, or they read The Stranger first. And they kind of think this is cool. And Camus was a cool guy, Maybe his philosophy isn't 100%, the best or true or reflective of everything. Maybe there's some blind spots in it. I mean, he himself revised his work as he went on, which should be telling to you. But if you got excited about Albert Camus, it's still worth getting excited about him. Myth of Sisyphus, the Rebel, the essays that come in between, like Letters to a German Friend, well worth reading. His fiction, his plays, worth reading as well. And so if you're still excited about him, if you stopped being excited and you got excited again, great, nothing wrong with that. Somebody else wrote in about Marx and materialism and Marxism. When you first get introduced to Marxism, which for me happened we had some basic background on it in high school, because I actually went to a good high school that thought it was important to learn about that sort of stuff, so that you could make your own informed decisions rather than just calling it, whatever crazy stuff conservatives do and then hiding it away. But in college, we actually read the Communist Manifesto, and I read some other things by Marx in philosophy classes. And, there's some things that are pretty cool in there. I mean, when you work a job and you're like, holy crap, labor theory of value, I can see it going on right here. And I can also see that there's some exploitation of us workers. Well, you don't have to only get that through Marx, but maybe Marx helps you out with that. And that's cool. Now, does that mean that he's right about everything? Or maybe you get turned off by seeing what people did with Marxism and you're like, I don't like this anymore, but it could still be cool. And we could talk about all sorts of other thinkers. You got to, so take, for example, what he had in the meme, Stoicism. You encounter Stoicism, you're like, this is cool. And then after a while, people are like, no, man, Stoicism is cringe, or Stoicism is uncool, or Stoicism is dorky. You don't want that. And then you come back to it and you find out, no, it actually is pretty cool. Or Plato's Forms, or Aristotle, or Kant, or Hegel, or pick whoever you like. Maybe there is something actually cool about that, right? So there's all sorts of possibilities. I will say that you may also discover that some things that you thought were cool back in the day actually turn out not to be so, because you know better now. So, if you were a super fan of Bertrand Russell and you're like, his philosophy is totally true. He's, standing up against all of the other things that are out there. And, then you realize, no, actually, a lot of his takes on historical philosophy are not very good, but he's still a good writer, still interesting to read and think about, you modify that. Or let's say as a kid, you got super into Ayn Rand and objectivism, and then you become better informed and realize that her takes on almost every philosophy are pretty crap, and that maybe you just don't want to have a justification for being a selfish bastard that's kind of unrealistic. You think it's not cool anymore. Yeah, that might be the case. I mean, I've had things that I was committed to in the past and thought was cool that turned out not to be. So we don't want to just endorse everything from our past like that. Another thing that came up, people wanted to get a little bit too conceptual about what does cool mean in this case. And I think, when you're dealing with memes, first of all, you're playing kind of fast and loose, right? So if your response to a meme is going to be, well, we must clarify what the terms are, you're being a little pedantic and probably a little bit of a show-off, and you're losing the thread. But, when it comes to responses like cool, we certainly could clarify that concept, clarify that subjective response, but maybe there's also something there that's very basic that we do understand. Those of us who you might say are attuned to the cool and to whatever its opposite is. And we can recognize it. We don't have to overcomplicate this with theories about modernity or anything like that. So I want to put that aside for the moment, because we could come back to that some other time, but we're just not going to do that here and now. Now, another interesting response that I had was somebody wrote, as philosophical views shift, there is as much reason to throw them completely away as to stop teaching them. And my response, because I, understandably took this person as endorsing something that I'm not standing for and actually saying we should get away from this, as saying, there's all sorts of like philosophical, let's call them, I actually use the word fads, but we could use trends or the spirit of the epoch, the Weltanschauung or stuff like that. That changes over time, right? And I think that we shouldn't be like following fads and giving into that sort of thing. Not that we shouldn't like speak the language of our times, but you don't want to uncritically, as I said, take cues from other people about what you should find cool and what you shouldn't. And now this person went on to clarify, oh, no, I mean personally held views. Maybe as time goes on, I've gone through all sorts of phases. At one time, I thought that, Nietzsche was the way to go. At other times, I thought it was Jean-Paul Sartre, and I had other phases as well. And you work through those phases, and then you realize, they don't have a lock on everything, and, you find some other stuff that you want to do. That's fine. We do have individual progression. Sometimes you are attracted to a thinker because they were the first one you encountered, or because other people are talking about them, and you're like, well, there must be something going on over there. Just like, we listen to music because other people are suggesting that, or we watch a show because other people are talking about it. That's all fine. And then maybe you move on from there. But if the suggestion is that, well, we don't do that sort of thing, who's the we? It's some imaginary elite of the people who think that they're cool, but actually aren't. They are in their own eyes, but when we go through it, we find that they're not. And they're the ones who are the arbiters of what we should be looking at. I'll just tell you one story that kind of illustrates this. When I first came to Southern Illinois University, where I ended up going to graduate school, and I was being shown around by one of the graduate students there, this person was asking me, so, what are you interested in philosophy? And I was like, well, on the one hand, I'm really into languages and philosophy of language. On the other hand, I'm, pretty interested in this Herbert Marcuse guy. And he looked at me and he's like, nobody reads Marcuse anymore. And I didn't say anything. I was thinking to myself, well, buddy, I do, and I know some other people who do. But he was convinced that, oh, we've moved on from that. If we're doing, and, he's thinking in terms of like critical theory. Who were people reading at that time? Well, Habermas and Adorno and Horkheimer, but not so much Marcuse. He's kind of, left in the past. Well, left in the past in that tiny little discourse, there were plenty of people reading Marcuse. As a matter of fact, I was in a Marcuse reading group, which unfortunately didn't last all that long, just, about 10 years ago. So there's always going to be stuff like that going on. And I think that there's always going to be people who are trying to tell you that this is what's cool, this is what's not. If you find this cool, there's something wrong with you. You're not fully developed. You're stuck in the past. You haven't read enough. And I think they come in three main varieties. There's the variety of, let's call it the academic status quo, where there isn't an awful lot of thought going into this. It's just like, well, this is what we teach. This is the stuff that matters. And what we don't teach, obviously, doesn't matter. So, these days, for example, you can find that there are a lot of people interested not just in Stoicism, but in Hellenistic philosophy, including the skeptics and the cynics and the Epicureans and eclectics as well, and Neoplatonists and Middle Platonists. If you were to walk into an average college or university just not even 50 years ago, just 30 years ago, and you were to say, I think I'd really like to do an intensive study of the Stoics, particularly Epictetus and Seneca, they'd be like, why? Nobody reads that crap anymore. I mean, in a few classes we'll do the Enchiridion, and maybe a little bit of some other stuff, but nobody really takes that seriously. The real action is Plato and Aristotle, and then we jump over all this silly Hellenistic and Roman imperial stuff into Plotinus and Augustine, right? Well, how the hell do they know? If you find something and you're like, man, this is cool, I like this, you're responding to something that maybe you haven't completely, fully, adequately interpreted it, but there's something there. If you're actually responding to it and you think there's something cool about it. And the fact that they're not teaching classes on it, or somebody's history of philosophy downplays it, or, the intro text doesn't include it, that's on them. That has nothing to do with whether those philosophical ideas, schools, movements are worth studying. Then we have another more or less academically situated thing, which is the cutting edge, And this is where you get, whether it's in analytic philosophy or continental philosophy, this is what everybody's talking about, man. This is what everybody's reading. This is what everybody's responding to. And everybody means like me and my friends and the people that I know, not the philosophy world in general, because they haven't actually surveyed it, So people are like, we got to find out what Zizek is saying and what Badiou is saying in response. Well, okay, but maybe they don't have a lock on our current situation. Maybe there's a whole bunch of other philosophers that are interesting, that are kind of getting left behind, some of whom, maybe are still contributing, like Jürgen Habermas. Maybe what Habermas has to say is more relevant than what, Zizek or Badiou are saying. Or, we could go on and on and on with examples. I don't have to belabor this because we're going to find so many others, I would say. And then I would say that because of the internet, we have this sort of online world of people who are always talking back and forth to each other, often about thinkers whose texts they're not even reading and are just learning through summaries or memes or stuff like that. And they'll be like, Hegelianism is the way to go. And you're like, what Hegelianism are you talking about? I mean, Hegel's super complicated, and they'll be like, master-slave dialectic, man, you can find it in everything. And you're like, well, I mean, that's just a tiny little sliver of his work. That's not the majority of it. And, they've got their shtick on what's cool and what's not. Or, man, Spinoza's where it's at. There's a lot of Spinoza stands out there that I think haven't read much Spinoza or understood much of it. But they're convinced that this is what the cool kids are into. And if you're into something else, well, then you're a dork. You're not cool. You're cringy. And how the hell would they know what's actually cool or not? They don't have, again, they're not the arbiters set up with some sort of, scepter and orb in their hand, getting to rule from the throne of online philosophy. So you don't have to buy into these prestige sort of like wannabe tell us what's cool and what's not networks or figures or anything like that. The other thing that I do want to say, just to wrap this up, is that I think that it's possible, I mentioned that there may be some figures that you thought were cool in the past and you realize actually they're not, right? That's a sign of growth and progress on your part, but there may be some figures, some ideas, some movements that you thought were cool in the past, but you didn't really understand that well. You were responding to something that's there. And now you go back to them and you're like, yeah, this stuff really is cool, but you have a better view on them. You have a fuller understanding, and now you can actually see what's going on. So I'll just use as an example, I was super into Nietzsche as a, early college student. I responded to him quite strongly. I even called myself a Nietzschean at some points, which basically meant acting like a selfish jerk and thinking I was better than everybody else and doing, cultural critique and stuff like that. And that carried on into grad school, and then I shifted away. I teach classes on Nietzsche these days. You've seen me shoot videos on him. I think that his works are valuable, but I don't think so for the same reason, because now I actually better understand Nietzsche and his works, and I see that what I was thinking was cool in Nietzsche in the past, at least some of it, was actually not really there, and I was projecting that into the text. And so I think this can happen with a lot of things. So, if you were into Albert Camus or Karl Marx or Immanuel Kant, or pick whoever else you want, you thought they were really cool back then. And now with a better understanding, you can say, yeah, they are cool, but not for the same reasons now that I better understand them. So great example of this coming from the meme, Plato's theory of the forms. Maybe you first encountered it and you were like, wow, this is really awesome. Now that you actually understand it in a fuller, more nuanced way that's reflective of what Plato actually says in his texts, maybe now you can see it as cool, but you are putting together a better judgment on it, a better affective response, because it's more in tune with what's actually there. So I just leave that out there for you. I do want to encourage you, if you did find things that were cool in the past, don't listen to other people telling you that they weren't cool and that you were dumb all along. Maybe you were onto something. Go back to them and see whether they're worthwhile or not, whether there was something there, and you'll be the judge of that yourself.